like, I mean, maybe it's just me looking for something, but it's remarkably, it will dovetail remarkably with what we were talking about in church this morning. This is called the narrative of evangelism. And so I have a question for you. Does your family or friend group have a good storyteller?
Yeah.
She says that because she didn't know my Uncle Stanley very well. A good story. What would make a person a good storyteller?
Keep people interested in your story.
Okay, but what does that?
Drama.
Humor.
Details.
Personal experience.
Many words.
Okay.
Relationship to what they're talking about, what they're speaking about.
Okay. Rachel has always, she says I'm a good storyteller. I don't know that I'm a good storyteller, but what she's referring to is something that she has. I don't want to say she's criticized me for it in the past, but she's commented when I'm telling a story, back in the day, something that happened at school. She would say, you don't have to relive the moment. Well, to me, that's the story. The way I felt at the time is the story. And if I tell it in a dispassionate way, to me, that's not a good story. That's the drama. That's not relatable to me. I think a good storyteller, I'm thinking of my aforementioned Uncle Stanley, although my other two uncles, my dad had 3 brothers and 5 sisters. I didn't know his sisters as well, but his brothers were all storytellers. Dad kind of is too, but not so much as the other ones. The other ones are a lot more talkative than Dad was, or is. But the ability to remember, you probably know someone like this. They can tell a joke any day, any subject. They have an appropriate joke. It's not the same one every time. They've got this vast catalog of memories. That was my Uncle Stanley. I worked with a guy like that too. Stories, the lesson writer here says, are fundamental to the human experience. From nursery rhymes to best-selling novels to our own life stories, storytelling marks us as humans, shaping us in the way we view the world. To be human is to be moved by stories. I have heard people before sort of disparage reading fiction, as though reading fiction, reading stories was a waste of time or worse than a waste of time. I personally don't think I could disagree more with that. I think stories are exactly what this person said. They are part of the human experience. If you would want to say, and try to make a case that fiction was beneath us because we are Christian or whatever, then you get a problem with Jesus. Because he told stories. He told stories that were made up. They were fiction. They weren't meaningless, but they weren't historical fact. They were parables. And so we have all encounters with stories. Evangelism is also linked to storytelling. This person says, in evangelism, we are bearing witness to the story of the world, the story of the gospel, and the way that those two intersect with the story of our own life. And so that's what we were talking about that today. Paul had his story. And I was saying, we all have a story.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
Can't stories be something that's make-believe also?
Sure. But when we, for the purposes of what we're talking about tonight, for most of this, when we talk about a story, we're talking about your story. Tell me, you sit down with somebody you don't know very well and you say, tell me your story. Most people are going to, they might ask what? Well, just tell me about yourself.
What did he say?
Aren't stories made up?
Oh,
They can be, I say.
yeah.
I mean,
That's not what
you're
we're
of
talking about.
you're of an age, as am I, when you were little, you probably were chastised at some point by your mother or grandmother and said, don't be telling me stories.
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
That was just a fancy way of saying you're lying.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, that's not what we're talking about. All right, so we're going to watch the session here, but here's some things to think about before we watch. What two things make up his conception of the narrative of evangelism? The narrative would be the storytelling. And what examples did he give of language about evangelism that we should leave behind? What two things make up his conception of the narrative of evangelism? And what examples does he give of language about evangelism that we should leave behind?
Maybe you're feeling like evangelism is a lost cause. Perhaps for you, it's not so much about trying things that didn't work, it's confusion around whether it's even okay anymore. I want to share with you my conviction that evangelism is not a lost cause. A friend of mine, Marco, heard me teach on the blessed practices, just like you have. So he began to pray for his friend, and one of them was Victoria. Victoria was far from God, but searching. At a very young age, her family quit attending church, and by the time she was an adolescent, she'd experienced so much pain that even if there was a God, she reasoned to herself, if God let me go through all that, he must not be a very nice guy. It was during middle school that she began to tell people that she was an atheist. Her Christian friends felt it necessary to tell her, well, in that case, you're going to hell, Victoria. Her young adult years were filled with lots of searching. Searching for what was missing in her life. She got married, but then cheated on her husband, which destroyed the relationship. She decided to move far from home, where she sought out happiness in sexual adventures that ultimately ruined her emotionally, relationally, and financially. She moved back to where she grew up, and that was when Victoria met Marco. Marco began to pray for her and to listen to her questions about searching. Their friendship was slowly turning into a romance. Marco had the wisdom not to push faith, Jesus, or God on Victoria too soon. He understood that he was to be the salt of the earth, but he also knew that rubbing salt into a wound like she had would be very painful. So he helped Victoria heal. Victoria began to ask Marco questions about spiritual things. And in turn, Marco asked her if she'd like to go to church. So she was very skittish about being around Christians, and the voices of her middle school friends still echoed. He reassured her it wouldn't be like that, so eventually she showed up at church, unsure, but with an open heart. Over the next few weeks, Victoria not only went to church, she also joined a small group that ate together every week. This group of friends became real friends. It became a transforming community in her life. Later on, she said, what I found in that group were some genuinely amazing people. It was those people who helped me find my way back to God. There are several reasons I'll never forget the day that Marco baptized Victoria. Well, first, because she courageously told the entire church her heartbreaking but beautiful story. But also because after she was baptized, the people that she feared would judge her gave her a raucous standing ovation. And lastly, because I got to see Marco use simple, everyday ways of blessing to love his friend to salvation. That blessing turned into a mutual one when Victoria and Marco got married. And Marco's simple prayer for Victoria grew into a beautiful family with 3 children. That story is a foreshadowing of where we're going later in this session. Let me remind you of the two objectives for these 5 sessions. Lost cause, reviving evangelism. Objective number 1. I want you as a small group to grow in your conviction that evangelism is not a lost cause. And I want to show you how you can revive evangelism in and through your group. And objective number 2, at the end of each session, I want to share with you one of the 5 blessed practices, simple, everyday ways to share God's love just like Jesus did. But let's start with the first objective, how your small group can revive evangelism. We introduced this model in the last session. At the core of reviving evangelism are your values. And your values are the convictions of the mind and the passions of the heart. It's what you believe, it's what you care about. In the last session, we talked about 3 biblical values, that people matter, eternity matters, and life matters. Our core values are so important because they influence what we think about, what we talk about, and ultimately how we behave. What is needed next in order to revive evangelism is a narrative. When I say narrative, I'm thinking in terms of both storytelling and language. Let's start with storytelling, and then we'll move to language. The reason I started this session with Marcos and Victoria's story is because it's a reminder of how powerful storytelling can be. Human beings make sense of the world through storytelling. And storytelling can be a powerful way to articulate values. For example, in that story was embedded the valuing of people. Victoria wasn't a project, she was a person, a friend of Marcos no matter what, and he treated her that way. And stories also reinforce the desired behaviors that you want to see in each other, in your small group, or in your church. So as we continue working to revive evangelism, storytelling is a powerful force. It's so important that in your group you share stories of how you're using the blessed practices. Tell stories that reinforce the values for reviving evangelism. I mean, that's exactly what Jesus did. In Luke chapter 15, Jesus tells 3 of the best church stories ever told. The story of the lost sheep, lost coin, and lost son. In each of the stories, Jesus reinforces the value of what is lost over what's found. The priority of searching and celebration when the lost is found. If we are to revive evangelism, we must tell our own stories of seeking and saving the lost. Because storytelling shows how it can be done, and it makes us believe that we can do it. In Luke 19, Jesus enters into Zacchaeus' story. Jesus spots a man in a tree, recognizing his desire for a relationship, and immediately connects by inviting himself over for a meal. I absolutely love this story. Take note what you learn about evangelism from this story. Jesus didn't take Zacchaeus to the temple. Jesus didn't immediately roll out a scroll and start reading and studying scripture. Jesus didn't make Zacchaeus sign up for a membership class or attend an event. Jesus joined this guy for lunch. And look what happened. One lunchtime conversation with Jesus, and Zacchaeus was transformed. His entire story shifted. I mean, after lunch, Zacchaeus repents of his former shady business dealings, pledges to repay those that he'd wronged, and not just pay them back one time. He promises to pay them back 4 times what he stole. And then Jesus ends the story by saying, salvation has come to this house today. There's so many things that Jesus teaches us in that story about reviving evangelism. For one, he challenges the common American mindset that evangelism only happens in a church building once a week. And then he replaces it with the idea that evangelism is relational, it's conversational, over meals, in homes, a dialogue instead of just a monologue, right? I mean, it's hard to do what Jesus did with that Zacchaeus while sitting in pews listening to a sermon on a Sunday morning. And many a worship pastor, I mean, they'll shoot you some serious kind of side-eye off stage if you're eating lunch during their carefully planned worship set. Storytelling is so important to reviving evangelism. Why? Because stories show us how to do it, and it reminds us it can be done. Narrative. It's not only storytelling, but it's also about language. And language matters. It was my Norwegian friend, Oystein Yerme, who told me, whoever owns the language owns the paradigm. That's how we view the world. And whoever owns the paradigm owns the future. And if we're ever going to revive evangelism in the future, we have to be intentional about creating and consistently using language that will mobilize Christians to reach the lost. The author of More Ready Than You Realize highlights that there's some language about evangelism that needs to be left behind if we're ever going to revive evangelism. Things like evangelism as a sales pitch, evangelism as a conquest, evangelism as warfare, or ultimatum, or threat, or entertainment, or show, or even something you have to do. In its place, the language around evangelism must change to hospitality, disciple-making, friendship, influence, invitation, companionship, conversation, something you get to do. So how do we live out what we profess in language and what we learn from stories regarding evangelism? This goes back to our second objective, and that's implementing the blessed practices into our everyday lives. In every session, I've shared with you a new blessed practice. Let's review. B, begin with prayer. I hope you're continuing to pray for 8 people, the people where you live, work, or play. L is for listen, E is for eat, the first S is for serve, and the last S is for story. Now let's talk about that third practice, E, eat. Now, this is one you should all be excited about. How many meals do you eat a day? Most of us 3. So 3 meals, 7 days a week. That gives you 21 missional opportunities to eat with the people you're wanting to bless. And that's without adding anything to your schedule. So what would it look like if you set aside just 1 or 2 meals out of 21 every week to bless people by eating with them? I want you to get a picture this. Picture a world where people are sitting together, eating together, talking to one another, listening to each other, connecting to one another. I believe that's a picture that God is wanting to see. I love what author Henry Nouwen wrote about the power of eating together. He said, when we invite friends for a meal, we do much more than offer them food for their bodies. We offer them friendship, fellowship, good conversation, intimacy, and closeness. When you start to practice blessing your neighbors, you might even discover that hospitality is a spiritual gift you didn't know you had. And I'm convinced you'll be amazed how you can impact the lives of people just over a meal. You're going to find yourself helping others eat their way into the kingdom of God. And remember, you don't have to do this alone. What if your small group started having barbecues, having parties, or dinners just once a month, inviting neighbors, coworkers, friends? What if you skipped the Bible study and decided just to hang out, eat, and party? I mean, that could be someone's first taste of your small group, or of your church, and of God. In their book, right here, right now, my friends Alan Hirsch and Lance Ford, they write about what it looks like to share meals and live on mission every day. They say that sharing meals together is one of the most sacred practices we can engage in as believers. Then they go as far as to say that if every Christian family regularly invited a stranger into their home for a meal once a week, we can literally change the world by eating. What if they're right? I think they are. I think Jesus understood this too. If you knew the only thing standing between a neighbor or a friend and eternal life was you eating dinner with them, would you do it? I know you would. So don't forget what's at stake here. We can revive evangelism by loving our neighbors and changing the world one meal at a time.
Okay. I'm going to start with the quote that he mentioned. Whoever owns the language owns the paradigm, and whoever owns the paradigm owns the future. There's an awful lot of truth in that. And it's important to me that that is something to remember when you read about current events, when you consider the way things are going in the world right now, the way things are going in our country. This is the part of what's going on in so many areas. So just, that might be worth pondering. Whoever owns the language owns the paradigm, and whoever owns the paradigm owns the future. For example, in, let's see, 9 days, 10 days, it's just going to be rainbows everywhere for a month. Everybody's going to be happy. Rainbows, rainbows, rainbows. Because somebody changed the paradigm. They changed the language. And they've done a good job at turning that around into a situation that they hoped for, a hoped-for future. They made that happen. The church can be involved in some of that as well. Okay, so that's one thought. Turn that one off. I have a question for you. He didn't mention this, but he talks in his opening remarks about whether evangelism is a lost cause. And then he always has said, too, or whether it's even okay to evangelize. All right, so I have a question for you. And if you don't know the answer, it's okay. No judgment. Just want to find out. Does anyone know what the word syncretism means? Syncretism. I hear something. Hey, there's my friends. Come on in.
Is that like being in tune with everybody?
In sync?
Yeah.
It's the same root. So syncretism is something that is very popular in the world today, but it's been very popular for a long time. Syncretism is something that the Israelites coming out of Egypt struggled with. In fact, syncretism is something that God told them, don't do that. Do not do that thing. Okay? Syncretism is when we take the cafeteria approach to what we believe as pertains to God. So I like, okay, well, the Bible says this, but Buddhism, it says this. Well, I like that idea, so I'll take a little bit of that. Hinduism says, oh, okay, I'll take a little bit of that. And so we just kind of take little bits from here and there and come up with our truth. Syncretism is what makes the idea that it, like when he says, he asks the question, sort of the rhetorical question, is it even okay to evangelize? A syncretistic worldview would not approve of me saying, let me tell you about Jesus. He said, he is the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father but by him. Oh, no. They wouldn't like that. Okay? So it's important to understand that whether you remember the word or not, it's important to understand that that's a thing. And that's one reason why our world is in the state it is. But it's not a new thing. It's not like, oh, what are we going to do now? No, I mean, that's what was wrong with the Israelites. They went to the promised land, and God said, when you get there, do not mix with them. It wasn't because he was looking for racial purity. He had allowed them and encouraged them to be witnesses to their neighbors and bring them in to the faith. He just didn't want that. Like, I don't want you to be like worshiping me on Saturday and then Moloch on Sunday and Dagon on Monday and Baal on Tuesday and Ashtoreth on Wednesday. No, you don't get to do all that. I'm a jealous God. God says, no, actually, it's just me. Okay, so we know that, but we should also know that many of our friends and neighbors, whether they know it or not, they actually are kind of syncretistic. Okay? Because if you don't have a strong conviction and attraction and connection to Jesus, then you're probably going to have that kind of a syncretistic view. These are the people also that would say things like, oh, well, I'm not religious, but I'm very spiritual. They've created this thing that works for them, that they think works for them. Okay? Okay, so every session, he's talked about the bless practices. BLESS. What does the B stand for?
Begin with prayer.
Begin with prayer. He has encouraged us to be praying for 8 people. Why 8? I don't know. I don't feel good because I haven't been praying for 8 people. That's okay. Start again. Pray for some. What if I'm only praying for 4? Well, hallelujah for you. You're praying for 4 people that don't know the Lord. He picked a number. Probably in his mind he's thinking, well, 4 couples, that gets you 8 people. If they've got kids, maybe it's only 2 couples. I don't know. But pick a number, pick your neighbor, pick specific, and begin praying for them. It doesn't have to be a physical next door neighbor. Think in terms of the man that says to Jesus, well, who's my neighbor? Well, Jesus wasn't talking about the person that lives, I live at 3831, so clearly he's talking about the people that live at 3833. No, that's not what he's talking about. He might be them, but it could be others too. Okay, so that begin with prayer. What's the L?
Listen.
Listen. How many would rather talk than listen? I would. I'll be honest enough to tell you that. I'd much rather talk than listen. That's right. But if we're going to have an effect on other people, we have to learn to be better listeners. I don't think it's a surprise or any secret that a lot of conversations that we have, and again, I've been guilty of this many times, they're not conversations, they are sequential monologues. I say a thing, and you're waiting until I get done or have to take a breath so you can say a thing, and then I wait till you're done so I can say a thing. But I'm not really, I'm doing that because mostly I'd really like you not to say anything so I can talk. Because what I've got to say is frankly much more interesting to me than what you might have to say.
And probably a lot more important, too.
Probably. That's why I'm thinking it.
What's that got to do with listening?
Nothing. That's what I say. We have to work on that. Some of us do. I do. Okay? So, begin with prayer. Listen. What's the E? Eat. And the first S? Serve. And the last S? Story. Okay. All right. So, begin with prayer. Listen, eat, serve, and story. What 2 things did he say make up his idea of the narrative of evangelism?
Eat, story.
No.
They're people, not projects.
That's true, but that's not what he said here.
He kept having 2 things. I couldn't figure out which 2 were the...
Okay. Storytelling and language.
Oh, yeah.
Storytelling and language. Okay? He was telling about this evangelism story about Marco and Victoria. So in this case, based on what I've told you this morning in church, and then a little bit before we heard that, you might have been thinking story, well, I mean, that's going to be my story. Well, it can be, for sure. You're going to know your story a lot better. But here's a story of someone else's experience. Those can be helpful and powerful to us as well. I read a thing today about the history of, it's a book about how Christianity has affected the world in positive ways. In the early days of the church, in the Acts days that we've been going through on Sunday morning, there was a point at which this person was, they gave some facts and figures that I can't repeat here because I don't remember. But they said there was a point at that early church time where they estimate there were 30,000 Christians. 30,000. But then they grew. They estimated the growth rate of the church for the first 200 or 300 years was 40% a year. Now, one thing I like about my phone is I've got a calculator that I can get to right here. So there are right now there's a little more, but we're going to say 2 million Nazarenes in the world. Okay? So 2 million. If we grew by 40%, that means in 1 year, now there are 2.8 million. Then in the second year, there's 3.9 million. It just snowballs from there. I love this stuff. I can't tell you how many fortunes I've achieved with my calculator. Thinking, if I could make 6% interest for the next 20 years, and I sit there and go through every year and do this. Okay, this is a better calculation. 40% a year. By the time like 250, 300 AD, there were estimated 30-some million Christians out of a total population of the Roman Empire of 60 million. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah, but things are bad now, Pastor. They're not Roman Empire bad. I mean, they're bad, but they're not Roman Empire like... I mean, there's some things that are bad, and they're not getting better in many ways. But we have to have what I mentioned today. We have to have the optimism of the gospel. Mm-hmm. What if we think about Paul, and I think that we just take for granted it's Paul. So yeah, I mean, well, that's Paul, right? What if Kim Jong-un, dictator of North Korea? What if you read on the news tomorrow that he'd given his heart to Jesus, and he decided that he was going to give all up, all the stuff that he'd been doing, he's given that up. First, he frees everybody that he's enslaved and imprisoned. And then he's going to become a preacher. Oh, that could never happen. It happened with Paul. Yeah. He was a terrible, terrible, rotten, murderous person. But the gospel saved him. Jesus saved him. Jesus turned something bad into something good. That is what Jesus does. So I don't know anybody that's as bad as the dictator of North Korea. I know some people that need the Lord for sure. Some of them only going to have a chance. I mean, it's scary to think about. They might only have a chance if they hear it from me somehow. So we have to take, kind of, this is why we're talking about these things. It's why it's important. All right, so they focused on the idea of that evangelism should be framed within the context of a story, both the story of the gospel and our story and the stories of our neighbors. Why do you think people tend to respond so well to stories?
Because you're not preaching to them, you're just telling them something.
Okay.
It's relatable to yourself somehow.
Okay.
I guess God somehow made us to just enjoy a good story.
Okay.
With TV and movies.
All right. She mentioned TV and movies. I'd throw in books there too. What if all of the TV shows the movies that you watch, the books that you read, the story ones, the fiction ones, what if you always sort of like looked for the connection to the gospel message? I'm not talking about, I don't want to offend anyone, I'm not talking about sappy Christian, the equivalent of Hallmark movies, only Christian. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about stories that the people that made them, they weren't trying to evangelize anybody. What if every time you could do that? If you got to where you thought about that, and you could tie something like that, that would be an effective tool for some people. Some people that you know. You know, if you, and it could be anything. For some people, it might be Star Wars. Somebody likes Star Wars. You know, that reminds me, there's like a whole bunch of stories of good and evil in the Bible, or whatever. You can pick one, find some connection. You just start like redeeming the time, so to speak, looking for ways. And again, we'd all agree that Jesus wants people to be saved, right? He wants lost people to be saved. Would we all agree that his plan, even though it seems ill-conceived, Jesus' plan is to use people like us to reach those people, right? Okay. If that's his plan, that they be saved, if his plan is to use people like us, might it be possible that if I pray a prayer like, Lord, help me to have my eyes open when I'm watching things or reading things, help me to find something that I can connect to the gospel, and then give me an opportunity to share that with somebody. Don't you think he might answer that prayer? Mm-hmm. I think he might. Jesus is all the time saying things that seem like they might connect to that. He is all the time saying things like, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. Some people are never going to make connections because they don't have ears to hear. They're not looking for anything. They're always on the surface. You got to dig a little deeper. I think that might happen. That might help. Just like I've told you before, when you read the Bible, if you read it with the idea, this is God, this is my one shot for you to speak to me. I need you to speak to me through this. I'm listening. I think probably he'll help you with that. Okay, so he said storytelling can be a powerful way to articulate values. What values do your favorite stories articulate?
The good guy wins.
The good guy wins. And Rachel, I'll elaborate for you further, Rachel. The good guy wins. There is never a question that the good guy is going to win. It's established early so that everybody can relax along the way. That is the kind of story she likes. She's admitted recently, though, that those are just a little too sappy, though. Okay, we do like to see justice. I like movies where justice occurs. That's a value. Where the weak are protected or helped. Where someone learns something and their life is improved. There is a movie. It's probably 25 years old now. Regarding Henry. Have you ever seen Regarding Henry?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now, before I say that's a great movie, it's been a long time since I've seen it. Probably there's some bad language in it. Okay, that aside, that's a great movie. The guy is terrible, horrible, and then he gets shot, and he becomes a different person. And now all of a sudden he's super nice. He's just kind to everybody. I like those kinds of stories. Because
some people, that's the only way we're going to help them be nice.
That's right. Some people need to be shot in the head. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So in the last session, the last time we were here doing this, he mentioned values, 3 values. They were the core values he said we should have. I don't suppose anybody remembers. He did mention them tonight. Okay, people matter, eternity matters, and life matters. People matter, eternity matters, life matters. See, I've mentioned a couple times now today the optimism of the gospel. We, in the Church of the Nazarene, as well as Free Methodist Church, Salvation Army, the Wesleyan Church, we are Wesleyan in our theology, in our understanding of the way God operates. We follow the teachings of John Wesley in his explanation of certain things. That is optimism. If I were to tell you, if I were to operate with the idea that some people have not been chosen by God, in fact, some people have been basically opted out of. God is not ever going to save them. He decided that a long time ago. And I have to hope that I'm one of the elect. But I might not be. And if I'm not, nothing I can do about it. Okay, to me, that's not an optimistic viewpoint. There are some people that love Jesus, I have zero doubt, that believe that way. But it's not an optimistic viewpoint. I don't know how you sell that viewpoint. I don't know how you evangelize with that viewpoint. I do know how they do it. They say, well, it's not my choice. It's not my job to decide who's who. I'm just supposed to, okay, whatever. But no, John Wesley would say, anybody. If Jesus, when he said, for God so loved the world, that whosoever, he meant whosoever. Anybody that believes in him will have everlasting life. Yeah, but you don't know this guy, man, he's just terrible. No, that's the kind of guy Jesus likes to change. So that kind of matters. The way we view God and the way those kind of values matter. They'll affect the way we look at things.
But you know, Pastor, it's not up to us to make that determination about what God can do and what he can't either.
Right. But I don't want to limit God.
Exactly. Yeah.
So people matter, eternity matters, and life matters. Okay? Dave says, to revive evangelism, we must tell our own stories of seeking and saving the lost, because storytelling shows how it can be done and makes us believe we can do it. In what ways do stories of evangelism help us believe we can evangelize too?
Well, if it's just a story about a regular kind of person, you can put yourself in that spot. You visualize it happening.
It's easy, and we have to be careful, I think. I mentioned this morning the Midwest Band and Orchestra Convention in Chicago that I would go to. I would love to go to that. Every year it would come up. I'd love to go and have a good time. But every year I would also come home. I would both be excited and then I'd just be crushed in my spirit. And the reason I'd be crushed is because I would listen to these bands, junior high and high school bands, that played at a level I knew there was zero chance that my kids were ever going to rise to that level. Zero chance. Now, if my mom were alive and I said that, she'd say, no, you just need to, no. This is an area where I actually knew more than mom did. There's maybe one. This is it. No, they were never going to be up to that. Okay? And I had to come to a point where I'd have to say, okay, yeah, my kids aren't going to be that. But they can be better. Because I've done this, I've seen that. So I say that to say this. We've been studying Paul. and I've been trying to make connections for you on Sunday mornings. It would be easy to look at Paul and say, I could never do that. I mean, he's like facing down the whole crowd and all. Maybe, but you know what? Maybe not. Maybe you can't do that with hundreds of people or whatever. But because of the inspiration of Paul with hundreds of people, maybe you do one or two. So we have to be careful in like these stories, because I know lots of us can get down, like, well, I can never do that. Personal stories. He asked the question here. Let's see. We must tell our own stories of seeking and saving the lost, because storytelling shows how it can be done and makes us believe we can do it. Sometimes I think we need to remember stories that we personally have been involved in. I have been fortunate recently. It's been within the last year. I don't remember how long ago it's been. A guy came that I knew growing up, and he came to church on a Sunday night. His name was Frank. And he said some things that just blew me away. He said more than one, man, it's because you took me to church, or you did this, and I knew that you, and I was like, I didn't remember that. But I've thought about it a bunch of times since then, and I thought, wow, all right, well, maybe I can do something. Maybe I can do this. And so we should remember those things. The question is asked here, for which there will only be your answer, not an answer or the answer. Does his storytelling approach make evangelism feel less intimidating to you?
Say that again.
Does Dave's storytelling approach make evangelism feel less intimidating to you?
Yeah, I guess because I would be telling my own experience, and nobody can really refute it because it's mine. It's a personal thing. And you may disagree, but you can't tell me that I'm wrong.
Or that it didn't happen.
Pardon?
Or that it didn't
Yeah, or
happen.
that it didn't happen because I was there and you weren't. But I think that if we just stick to our own story, then that would make it a little bit easier, I think, we don't have to come up with some elaborate, I was telling this morning in Sunday school, I can't tell you chapter and verse, well, 2 Timothy 3:4 says, I can't do that, but I have enough knowledge that I can go find something in there, and I think that would be my story, that I have enough knowledge of this that I may not be able to answer all your questions, but at least I know where to go find them.
I think that's really important too. Our story, yes, but we also need to be constantly in the Word, because we need that knowledge to go along with it. If they ever get interested, you got to be able to tell them more than
Yeah, your experience may be deeply personal, but if you can't connect it to the Bible, then you might be in danger of that syncretism idea too.
Yeah.
But to be careful of that we, my story of being saved is not a story of how I finally decided to shape up and do what my mom and dad were telling me to do. Oh, well, you're just a good boy because, no, that's not the story. My story has to include how rotten I was, and they didn't, well, I don't think they knew it. I'm pretty sure they didn't know how rotten I was. If they did, they put on a good act. And they weren't shy about telling me when I messed up, so I'm pretty sure they didn't know. That's my story. That it's not a story of, well, it's easy for you because you grew up in that home. Well, yeah. But I mean, I was good at messing it up. I mean, I have a story I can tell. And we have to remember, like, we don't want it to we don't want the story to glorify us.
it doesn't end with us.
The story, yes. The story has to glorify God, has to glorify Jesus. I'm glad I quit doing the things I was doing. But it was Jesus that made it possible. My home was fantastic. My parents were awesome. But I had enough sin in me to wreck it all and have no positive effect for me. I was going the opposite direction as fast as I could go, and only my cowardice at not being more openly rebellious in front of my parents kept them from knowing how far gone I was. But Jesus saved me. That we have to remember, it's a story about Him. It's a story about Him. Well, we're going to stop there. We do have enough to come back next week. So we will we'll follow Tom's lead and do two for one. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, thank you for the session tonight. Thank you for Dave's teaching about the bless practice. Help us to, if we haven't been doing that, to just kind of redouble the effort to pray for people that are sort of in our list, in our micro mission, people that we're running into, people that we're around, that we can begin praying for, that we can learn to listen to them, that we can take this next step of maybe inviting them to eat together. And as a way of building into their lives and helping them to know we care about them, not as a conquest for you, but we care about them because they're important to you, and so they're important to us. Thank you for this session tonight, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.